History, politics and art, the 3 points around which, as I understand it, this symposium revolves. A daunting agenda for anyone. There's no issue over which the various theories of modern art have been more clearly polarized than the question of just how these 3 points are to be related. In the advance notice by which I was informed about the symposium, a particular cast was given to the business of their triangulation. An apparent repoliticization of art and rediscovery of history was associated with a debate about form and genre, and more specifically, with a partial reinscription of narrative onto fine art. Clearly, though, this present reinscription of narrative is intended to reflect the local spotlight cast on the work of William Kentridge, for whom narrative techniques have been indispensable, and whose oppositional credentials are well established in relation to the context of apartheid and its aftermath, which is fair enough. I might otherwise have been somewhat confused by talk of repoliticization and of a recent rediscovery of history, since the artistic practice with which I'm most closely engaged and identified seems to me to have been continuously and inescapably steeped in history for at least 35 years, and to have been possessed over the same period of a vexed, if often involuntary, political consciousness. I should be explicit then about the position I occupy. While I write and sometimes speak in my own name as a historian and theorist of art, and while I have a salaried post in a university, still just, I'm also associated with the artistic practice known as art and language. This name designates the artistic work of Michael Baldwin and Mel Ramsden, and my collaboration with them in the production of texts and papers of various kinds. The present paper is a product of that collaboration. The artwork of art and language is uttered and displayed as material for exhibition in art galleries and museums. What you see on the left is an installation for an exhibition at the Tapies Foundation in Barcelona in actually both these are 99, composed of a wall of work, and a similar installation at PS1 in New York. These are both, as I say, from 99. The work of art and language also appears in the form of essays and articles, many of them for the academic press. And it also takes the form of talks, lectures, and related performances addressed to a largely academic milieu, in which this one, I suppose, might count in a small way. These facts account for the existence of 2 types or forms of work. They describe necessary but by no means sufficient conditions. Some other conditions are supplied by a practice that we have called essayistic. The work that this practice produces is often not what it seems to be, whether it appears in the form of the artwork or of the written article or other publication. We've also collaborated with the Jackson Pollock Bar of Freiburg in what they call theory installations, and with the rock band The Red Crayola in the production of musical albums and singles. Art and language is not altogether resistant to the attractions of storytelling. Passages of something like narrative have sometimes featured among the textual materials incorporated into painting-like surfaces. This is one of a series of so-called hostage paintings from about 1991. One long series of artworks from the 1990s employed swatches from a pornographic sadomasochistic text in the form of a kind of novel. This is a work called Wrongs Healed in Official Hope, seen entire on the left and a detail from one of the wall panels on the right. You can just see it has a kind of printed text as a part of its sort of painting-like surface. Detail of that. Generally speaking, though, the art that emerges from the art and language studio tends to abjure narrative form. It could be said to maintain a kind of consistent, though edgy, relationship with the modernist unities, and an abiding, if disenchanted, concern for those traditional concepts of autonomy and aesthetic intention to which modernist theory gave special emphasis. Of the modernist tendency to disparage narrative, it may at least be said that it entailed a constructive respect for the opacities and complexities of both language and pictorial form. To those born-again Walter Benjamins who would celebrate the political effectiveness of matches between text and pictures, we suggest that the corporation is in general deaf and blind to the content of such things, except at the lowest journalistic level. It's more to the point of the present proceedings that, diverse as the practice of art and language has been, we have inevitably been much preoccupied with the matter of genres, of their restricting or enabling functions, their exclusions and inclusions. It is the possibility or necessity of reanimating the concept of genre that I want principally to address in this talk. We face two particularly besetting tendencies. First, the development of a corporatist knowledge culture that has flattened literature, art, and the rest of the so-called humanities into information. Second, the development of an analogous but distinct corporate culture as the culture of the art world. One of the effects of this latter development has been to establish a middle-brow vacuity that perfectly fulfills the purposes of corporatism as a form both of production and of consumption. The Spanish critic Carlos Guerra has described the practice of art and language as self-critical, self-destructive, and indeed self-annihilating. Work on the left is Art and Languages, the studio at 3 Wesley Place, painted by Mouth #2 from 1982. It's quite a large work. It's about the same size as Courbet's studio, if you know that. It's about just over 20 feet across. Work on the right is Hostage number 19 from 89. There is one thing of which we can be sure. In the eyes of the managers and the beneficiaries of the corporate tumour that embraces both the knowledge economy and the Gesamtkunstwerk that is the modern art world, it can only be favourable to their expansionist aspirations that the definition of terrorism should expand outwards to embrace all forms of critical negativity. What then might the ideas of viral aesthetics, of hacking, and of destructivity have to offer as ways to think about art and language's own practice? It may be salutary to look back beyond the spectacular culture that now flourishes under the name of conceptualism to the original conceptual art movement of the late 60s and early 70s, the last real avant-garde moment, and the one in which art and language had its origins. We recently published an article containing reflections on that moment and on its treatment in American art history. The article went by the title "Voices Off." Among other things, we tried to describe the kinds of development or action by which an art and language contribution to conceptual art might be characterized. We were particularly concerned with art and language's early move away from those kinds of linguistic ready-made that picked out more or less exotic objects or states in the world, and our involvement instead in the production of increasingly discursive texts. What we wrote was this: as the text ceased to function as a form that usurped the place of painting on the gallery wall in the manner of one of Kossuth's definitions, so the legacy of the containing frame also diminished. One of Kossuth's definitions on the left from 67 and a work by Lawrence Weiner from 72 on the right. As both effects weakened, so did the power of those formal constraints on the length of the text that characterized the definitive post-minimal genres of conceptual art as they were established in New York between 1967 and 1969. It was our experience at this point that the lack of formal constraint on the extent of the text allowed the mechanisms internal to its discursive production to take over. What drove the discourse in practice was not now the need to produce the brief illusions of transparency, but those recursive and dialogical processes by which the discourse itself was pursued and continued. This was a crucial moment in the establishment of what might be described as a new genre. I may myself operate largely as an academic, and find myself in consequence frequently bothered and enraged by the besetting violence and absurdity of a managerial culture. But insofar as art and language has a Weltanschauung, it is not generated by the university, nor does academia provide much in the form of a material base for the practice. While the university, the art school, and other academic circumstances may compose one of art and language's institutional frames, it is principally to the art world that the practice looks. Perhaps it's in virtue of this second institutional frame that art and language's own destructiveness or destructivity might be identified then. While we have in common with Liu a concern at the growth of what he calls the corporate tumour, from a perspective distinct from the humanities department of the university, his tumour looks much like the Gesamtkunstwerk, into which a significant proportion of art and language's production is inescapably uttered. The Gesamtkunstwerk is a condition of something like cultural heat death. This is to say, its accomplishment signals the coming of a circumstance in which distinctions lose all meaning, except as the ornaments and instruments of corporate interests, a process certainly commensurate with the flattening out of knowledge culture. That all we do may simply feed this Gesamtkunstwerk is one of the most besetting of the unbearable determining conditions I referred to at the outset. It is not something we do, rather it is something that is done to us. How then are we availed of any possibility of resistance? What must be at issue here is a social formation of some kind, not so much a way of making art or literature or whatever as a way of living. For all that it is with regard to the Gesamtkunstwerk that art and language destructiveness is principally considered, it is a condition of our independence that we maintain a stake in both worlds, the art world and the academic, a foot in each of the doors that might always be slammed in our face. It should be clear that our relative distance from Liu is not a matter of our pretending to cleanliness in respect of either world. Indeed, our impatience with university art and university art history has much to do with the stultifying propriety of both. Our practice is not the product of any kind of interdisciplinarity that might be conceived in an academic profile or curriculum. Rather, it is made from the varied economic, professional, and other contingencies of our lives. If there is a resource of actual resistance anywhere to be discovered, it is not such as can be embodied in the bounded singularity of any artwork, or in any object, or in any iconoclastic gesture. The means of resistance can only be sought in the form of a practice that hacks into or pollutes the very corporate tumour in which it is embedded. This is the best we can make of the requirement of independence. It is under these conditions that we hypothesize genres as more or less informal ways of organising activity that may become both the forming conditions of practical work and the necessary points of reference for discussion and criticism. Michael Baldwin has said of art and language's early work that it was conducted in the light of a kind of emergency conditional. It was philosophy in case it was taken to be art, and it was art in case it was taken to be philosophy. It's a work from 1967 called Title Equals Text. We might say that art and language's presence in two worlds serves similarly as a kind of guarantee against the self-insulating effects of the academic essay on the one hand and the exhibitable artwork on the other. I mentioned earlier the essay Voices Off. This was published a year ago in the academic journal Critical Inquiry. The text of the essay also appears in minuscule type as a component of the surface of an artwork made in the form of a chair. From the point of view of the academic journal, it transpires that the production of the article, with all its arguments and constructions, goes to and is an organic part of an artistic practice that, as it were, misuses it on a chair. From a standard academic perspective, this might be taken as evidence that insufficient intellectual distance has been achieved in the writing. The article would thus be impoverished and the more easily dismissed. From another reader's perspective, however, the fact that the article is firmly part of the chemistry of an art practice might be taken as a theoretical and historical enrichment. On the other hand, a chair with 40,000 tiny words of occasionally intemperate theory enters the institutional milieu as a sort of conceptual artish structure possessed of a certain consumable virtue. But once discovered, the content of the theory, indeed the very presence of the theory, is a horror that renders the chair unassimilable to the institutional circumstance. The work is thus effaced. I've suggested that what we face is what Liu describes as a corporate tumour impinging upon the humanities in general, and what art and language refer to as a Gesamtkunstwerk absorbing all aspects of artistic culture. Not by any stretch of the radical imagination are these the kind of proto-revolutionary conditions under which conflicts of interest are publicly dramatized. Rather, what is in prospect is a gradual and progressive annihilation of significant differences and discriminations in the name of an expansionist knowledge culture on the one hand and a commensurate conceptualist art culture on the other. I've argued in the name of art and language that what is required is a tightening of criteria and the formulation of genres from which principles of negation can be extrapolated. But it is crucial that the genres themselves or their contents should be availed of independence. Alan New writes of an activity of hacking just short of terrorism. If an artistic recourse to narrative is to offer some further potential, what will be required is that the use of the relevant medium be such as to provide resistance to the conscription of content. As I understand it, it is in part the need to stiffen this resistance that accounts for William Kentridge's various exploratory techniques. I take it that one problem we share is how to hold on to the historical specificity that the managerial knowledge culture tends to dissuade and to erase, without rendering incident picturesque, transparent, and conscriptable. For our part, we look to modes of critical negation and provocation that sit competently but uneasily between different institutional spaces, never presenting a complete face to either, but holding out a prospect of conversation in both, one in which a dark history is indeed remembered, and the prospect of an even darker incursion continually held in view. Thank you.
Thank you to Charles for echoing what I'm sure that many of us, certainly those who work in art establishments, suffer symptoms of a corporate tumour that we can easily recognise.